Looking to take your financial knowledge to the next level? You're in the right place. Welcome to Ask Ralph, offering accounting, technical, and financial advice. Whether you're looking to save taxes or improve your business, he's got you covered. Here's your host of Ask Ralph, Ralph Eastup Jr.
Let's take some time and talk about some tax breaks for the military. If you're interested in more in-depth information, you can look at the Internal Revenue Service publication number 3, which is a complete guide for armed forces and taxes. But today I just wanted to hit on some of the big picture topics that we can talk about. One of the first ones that is that of a deadline exclusion. So one of the things, if you're serving in active duty in the military, you will have some automatic extensions of time to both file and pay your taxes. You just want to be aware of those and make sure that you're not charged any penalties or any type of thing if you were in active military service and you were unable to file or pay your return. The second thing is combat pay exclusion, and this is a thing that is huge for our military service people, and that is if you serve in a combat zone, then your combat pay is partially or fully tax-free. This also works for people who serve in support of those people in a combat zone. And there's a great deal of discussion we can get in talking about what is combat pay, what is not combat pay. But for our discussion today, generally, combat pay would be anything that's in a combat zone. Now, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds here for those of us who are not in the military, but generally these things are handled on the W-2, but I thought it was good to talk about these in case for some reason that your W-2 was incorrect. Now, whenever you talk about military, you always hear about, well, we move from base to base. And that is true if you serve in the military. My uncle is a retired colonel from the military, and I know he would move around both in the United States as well as overseas. So one of the areas that we really should spend a couple minutes on, and that is moving expenses. So to the extent that your moving expenses are not paid for by the government, you are able to deduct those. And that would include things such as moving your personal belongings from point A to point B. It would also include any storage or insurance or travel expenses that are incurred in that move. Unfortunately, it does not include the cost of meals or any, as the IRS says, lavish or extravagant side trips. So let's be careful not to make any of those. So you want to just make sure you're keeping track of all the expenses related to your move that were not reimbursed directly to you. Now, we talked about combat pay a few minutes ago, and we talked about how that's excluded from income. Well, when it relates to some of the deductions or some of the credits available in the tax return, the exclusion of combat pay actually could hurt you. So one of the things that the IRS has done is they've allowed you to include your combat pay in a calculation of a couple of credits. The first of which is the Earned Income Tax Credit. So the Earned Income Tax Credit, it allows you to include it in your taxable income. What that effectively does is it may result in you getting a bigger refund as part of that Earned Income Tax Credit, because you have to have earned income in order to get that credit. And if, for example, you were in a combat zone all of a particular tax year and you didn't add back your combat pay, then you wouldn't qualify for that. It also allows you to make an IRA contribution in a year that you had combat pay. So you're able to add to your compensation or your income any combat pay you received to be able to contribute to an IRA. Because again, with IRAs, you have to have earned income in order to do that. Now, one of the areas that can be problematic for those serving in the military is, well, what do I do if my spouse is serving and can't sign the tax return? So there are some provisions within the tax code that allow for this. One of the easiest things to do, frankly, is to get a power of attorney. Power of attorney would cover this completely. But in the event that your spouse is unable to sign, there are some things that you can do to where you can sign on their behalf. And that's generally if they're absent due to certain military duty or conditions. And you will find more information about this both in this publication number 3, as well as if you're in the military, your legal office on your installation will be able to help you with this. I mentioned earlier that we have both active duty military personnel, and we also have a pretty large reservist force. So one of the questions I was asked by one of my listeners was, could I deduct the expenses related to my travel for being in the reserves? And the answer is yes. And it's a yes qualified by, it has to be more than 100 miles away from your home to deduct those unreimbursed travel expenses. Now, that allows them to use what's called a Form 2106 and put that on the Schedule A tax return. Now, one of the other areas I get questions about is, well, can I deduct my uniform? Well, this is a tricky one. And it's one that when I did some research, I was surprised. So you can deduct the cost of certain uniforms if you can't wear them while off duty. So the IRS code basically is making a position that if you're able to wear your military uniform both on duty and off duty, you cannot deduct that. But if you're wearing it on duty only, you can. So that would be, your typical dress uniform. They mention in there any kind of insignias or swords or things you have like that. So that's something you might want to take into consideration. Now, of course, any of these deductions you need to reduce by any allowances that they are given to you. So one of the things as you're wrapping up your military service, if you leave the military and look for work, you may be able to deduct some of the job research expenses, and you may be able to include the cost of travel, preparing in a resume, and job placement agency fees, as well as moving expenses. So when you decide to leave the military, you also have the ability to take advantage of both the search for a new job as well as the moving expenses related to finding that job. Now, for tax help for members of our military, you can certainly go to Publication 3, as I talked about, or you can go to the irs.gov and get some assistance there as well. One of the other areas I will tell you that I've pointed some of my customers and clients to is, and that's Military One Source. And Military One Source is a place where you can go and get additional assistance in the event that you need it for handling any of your tax-related questions related to the military. So I hope this was helpful for everyone. And, because this is an area that is sort of a more, unusual area to discuss because, not everyone is affected by this. But, with it being Veterans Day, I thought it would be a great idea to take a few minutes and make this discussion. And again, from Ask Ralph and our staff, I just wanted to thank everyone who is serving in the military or who has served in the military, and all those people who serve at home. And that's the family members of those in the military. I'm fortunate enough that, my oldest son just became a member of the military. And so he's doing his duty, and I certainly appreciate everyone who has done that and continues to do that moving forward.
You've been listening to Ask Ralph, brought to you by Sazio Accounting Plus. Please subscribe to and rate our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating and review. Our podcast is produced by Carolyn Peters. Thank you for listening, and be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Ask Ralph Media. You can also hear me each week on 1450 WILM and on 1410 WDOV in Delaware and on the iHeartRadio app. Submit your questions or ideas for future shows by sending an email to AskRalph@AskRalph.com.
The information contained in this episode of Ask Ralph is based on data available as of the date of its release. Sagio Accounting Plus and Ask Ralph Media Inc. is under no obligation to update this content if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances, and any information provided is not to be considered as financial, tax, or legal advice. Please consult your tax advisor or attorney before acting on any material covered.